How many of you have been to a church where during an invitation time at the end of the service you had the opportunity to do one of several things? One is to accept the Lord. The other is to ask for membership. The other is to surrender to full-time Christian service, a term I don't like because we're all there, right?
Yeah.
And what's the last one?
Rededication.
Rededication.
Yeah.
Rededication. How many of you, if I may ask, have gone down to the altar and pledged to rededicate your life to Christ? Okay, some of you have. Did it take this time? Or?
A long time ago.
And
A lot to ask forgiveness for, so I'm back on the path.
I think I've told you this story too. It's probably time for somebody with new stories to be up here. But I was on a student ministry team preaching in Missouri, and at the end of the service gave an invitation. Somebody came forward and knelt at the altar, and somebody from the church prayed with her. And pride is not really the right word, but I think that was the first person that had ever come forward and made a visible decision when I was preaching. I think I said something to the pastor. I said, well, it was nice to see a decision made, and he said, oh, she goes down every Sunday. And that's fine. That's fine. What's the Baptist word for needing to be rededicated? Backslider. Backslider. Not backbiter. That's WMU. No. Edit that. Edit that. We are, and I think this is probably a good message for as we look at the rebranding. We've been talking about that for several months. It's going to happen this spring, Lord willing. And this is a church that I guess we're getting close to 15 years ago was replanted. It was vacant for a couple of years, the actual building was, and so a new ministry came in. And so we see renewal. Sometimes businesses will have a grand reopening. They'll shut down and do some redecorating. I remember the little hamburger place in Warrensburg, Missouri that we actually ate there. We had I say the name of the town because their main attraction was the Warrens Burger.
Oh.
And it has a place of reverence in our hearts because that's where we went for our first anniversary. And I tell you, that romance has still been burning. But they shut down for remodeling, and I swear we came back 2 weeks later, and the only difference I could see was that there was new duct tapes on the bar stool. So there's all kinds of little mini metaphor sermons that you might make out of here. But God is resetting. So the people have been released from slavery. They have crossed the Red Sea miraculously, and now they've got their years ahead of them. If we remember the framework of the Hebrew people, they had been enslaved for roughly 400 years. Now Joseph had predicted that they would eventually be released from Egypt because he made a request that survived the generations that my bones will be taken to the promised land. So his optimism was kind of interesting that we see a glimpse of here in the Exodus story. We didn't talk about, and it's certainly sermon worthy. Most of chapter 15 is a praise and worship song about their victory over Pharaoh and his soldiers as they came across the Red Sea, and the sea swallowed up the pursuing army. So what was happening in those 400 years is that father after father, after mother, saved the story of Abraham and the promise of the promised land, generation after generation. But you know, those things can fade. And so the Hebrew people, we tend to think of them as monolithic, and that they were the same all, from Abraham on. But this was an era where would they have known all of the richness of who God is and the significance of whatever traditions and ceremonies that they had at that point, what would that have meant to them? Plus, they had lived in a polytheistic country for many, many generations. And it's very difficult, as we know, to maintain a pure and, in our case, biblical based belief system when you are surrounded by paganism, by doubt, by all kinds of negative and even satanic influences. And so their spiritual state of mind was probably not really very strong, and we'll see evidence of that as we move along in Scripture. And so one of the things that is probably an overarching thing that influences what happens, context, that what happens here in the next few chapters is God's reset of his sovereignty and power and knowledge over the people. Now, Moses had intimate contact with God. God spoke to him, and so Moses had a particularly close relationship and understanding, although we see he has a lot of learning to do. But not only was he to be a deliverer, but he was also to be a conduit to reteach the Hebrew people about their faith, not just about their ancestry, but about who God is and how they should relate to God. So keep that in mind as we think about their reaction to things, the Hebrew people's reaction to things. Also, because what we're going to see is some fear, and we're going to see some rebellion, and we're going to see some grumbling, and we're going to see some opposition to Moses throughout the next few chapters that we study. And we're going to see a lot of grace and patience on the part of God's interaction. Now, we think of God's wrath and God's fed-upness. We know that this generation is going to be part of that generation that is not allowed to go into the promised land because of their lack of faith. But that happens after God has dealt with them and proven them time and time again. And this new relationship with God is fresh. And it's not only fresh, it's miracle-based. It is not necessarily a daily walk. It is something that when they think about their faith, oh, who is God? Oh, he's the one that broke Pharaoh's spirit. He's the one that parted the Red Sea. Well, what about daily life? And I think, again, if we're going to make a little mini sermon in application, we can think about some folks who call themselves believers, but they require the miraculous. They require the experiential. They require the excitement. They require the mountaintop experience. And their daily walk is very, very weak when they get separated from those kinds of things. But we look at the Hebrews is us.
Yes.
The Hebrew nation is a picture of us. That's why, one of the reasons why it was preserved for these thousands of years, so that we can look back and we have to ask, like the disciples around the Lord's table at the Last Supper, is it I? Is it I? Is it I? The Lord made let's take a look at verse 22 of chapter 15. Then Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea, And they went out to the wilderness of Shur. Now, again, all these geographic places and topographical names, we don't know exactly where they are, and I don't know how to pronounce them, so you can do your own research on that. And like with many things, and again, a quote I've used before, if you laid 100 theologians end to end, you would never reach a conclusion, because there are so many different theories about so many different things. They came to Mara, and does anybody have a little note in their Bible about what Mara means? Bitter. Do you remember Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi? After her family disaster, she goes back to her hometown and she tells everybody, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Same word. They came to Mara. They could not drink the water at Mara because it was bitter, and that's why it's named Mara. The people grumbled to Moses. The people grumbled to Moses. There's a whole book in the Bible called Lamentations. Lamentation, oh God, why is, and you see this in Psalms, and you see it in Proverbs. Why do the wicked prosper? We see it among some of the prophets who, give so much, and they see so much trouble. And, Lord, why are these things happening? That's a lament. A lament is something that we can honestly come to God with in our doubts and our confusion, and perhaps even in suppressing anger. Why, God, why? But when we cry out to God in that way, in a lament, that is something that is God honoring, because we are seeking for an answer, we're seeking for a response, we're seeking for understanding with the unspoken faith that God indeed does have a response to that. That is different than grumbling and complaining. All right, do you see the distinction? So they grumbled to Moses. And as is going to be evident in so many other ways, to Tanya's point, they just came out of a big miracle. They just came out of a big miracle. All of that amazing stuff, and they're like, yeah, we don't even have anything to drink out here. And so the people grumbled to Moses, what are we going to drink? So he cried out to the Lord. I tell you, Moses, he didn't want to be doing this anyway. And now, again, he was the one. It was him and Aaron who presided over this great splitting of the sea and the great closing over Pharaoh's pursuing army. But I could almost translate some of these verses as the people crying out saying, what have you done for me lately? So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and when he threw it into the waters, the water became drinkable. The Lord made a statute, an ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. A couple of things. These people were without the fullness of the law. We talk about the Mosaic law. Well, obviously that happened during this trek. There were many more laws in addition to the Ten Commandments. In fact, we see a restatement from the kind of the informal Ten Commandments to the commandments on the tablet. So God is revealing some laws and some requirements to these people, event by event. Made a statute and an ordinance, and he tested them there. And here's the statute, or what we would call a conditional covenant. There are some promises that God has made, and God's going to do that regardless of what anybody else does. But many of the covenants, many of the contracts, many of the agreements, many of the statutes are conditional. You do this, I'll do this. You fail to do this, or you do something contrary to what I've said, then you're going to suffer consequences. We see this particularly in what we refer to as the Deuteronomic covenant that we'll get to one of these days. So here's his covenant. He said, if you will carefully obey the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, pay attention to his commands, many of which had not been revealed yet because they did not have the Torah. I will not inflict any illnesses on you that I inflicted on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. I am the Lord who heals you. One of the remarkable things about this great march, the first 40 years as well as another 40 years, is we don't see mass illness. Now we see some things that God imposes on them, like the snake bites and some other things. We don't see clothes wearing out. We don't see people dropping dead. So God makes a miraculous, regular provision for them, which became their normal, and therefore they, like us, were probably not quite as grateful as they could have been about the daily, unspoken, routine blessings. I was able to get out of bed this morning on my own. Am I thankful for that? Yes. Do I take it for granted? Less and less every day, but basically yes. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 date palms, and they camped there by the water. So some kind of oasis. Now the entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin. Now we don't want to confuse that with sin as we know it, meaning evil or behavior contrary to God's holiness. It's just a root word that refers to a particularly geographic area. In fact, probably Mount Sinai comes from this region, Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. So, how long had it been since their last really big miracle? Because I don't know, the tree in the water that makes the water taste good. Was that a big, on the scale of miracles, would they have really given that a big thing? So, oh, look, Moses found an herbal remedy for bad water. The 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. So they're 6 weeks out, maybe, from the big miracle. How far are you from the last big miracle? Was it far enough that you've forgotten about it? Was it far enough that you think, oh, this is never going to happen again? That this is not something God intends to do all the time? I don't know the answers to those questions or the significance of the answers, but it may give us pause to think. But it's right before we have the narrative that the entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. I don't know that this is a really accurate memory of their life in slavery in Egypt. Oh man, we had a Golden Corral buffet every afternoon. I don't think so. You brought us into this wilderness to make the whole assembly die of hunger. Now, I'm sure there were faithful and reverent and patient, trusting Hebrews in this group of Israelites. They were also people who were still tentative about their faith, but there were also some measure of Egyptians who were just along for the ride because they weren't having a great life in Egypt, and they saw this mighty God, one of many, but this particularly mighty God that was apparently even greater than Pharaoh, had done all these good things for the Israelites, so they're packing along with them. So you have a group of people, and it's a type that we need to be aware of as a church, as churches. A group of people who like the good stuff that they saw in the Hebrew God, but they weren't really invested in the way that the Hebrews were. They didn't really understand the promise. They didn't understand the singularity. And, you know, I've been in various churches and in church life for a long time. And it seems like, not always, but often that the worst grumblers or the worst troublers are people that are really not super invested in the church. We had a controversy with a staff member when I was chairman of deacons back in Missouri. And so I called a special meeting to deal with some of that. And all of a sudden this couple, who was a big fan of this guy, but attended about once a month or less, never saw him at any other business meetings. Don't know if they were tithers or not. I've never known, don't know here either. But, you know, and sometimes people who are tithers think that gives them a controlling share of the church. So give out of your heart. But I really resented them showing up and thinking that they have a right to speak up and talk about the future of the church when they were not truly invested in the church as it presently was. In fact, that same staff member was a youth director, and he would have the youth downstairs while everybody else was on our monthly Wednesday business meeting. But when it came to budget time, he'd bring all the youth upstairs, many of whom were members by baptism, and all of a sudden you had a voting block of about 20 kids who did what the youth director wanted to do. All I'm saying is, we need to be careful about this thing that I preached from day one, and that's the difference between stewardship and ownership. And I tell you, one of the things that I feel very strongly about as pastor is protecting you all from people like that. And I've told you, there have been people who come in and without investing themselves in the church will say, why aren't you preaching this? Why aren't you doing this? We should do this. We should do that. And I'm like, you got no voice in this whatsoever. And then we've had a person or two who were invested in the church, but they were invested in their own interests in the church, and again thought that they had a controlling share because of their use of giftedness or whatever. Now I'm just saying we need to be careful about Egyptians in our tribe. So there's nobody here that I'm thinking about in particular. But if you've been in church life very long, you know what I'm talking about. If only we had died. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. Do you see, in the context of God needing to teach his people or rededicate his people or replant or restart or re-educate his people, one of the reasons for his great patience and mercy here? It's a little dangerous to even hypothetically say, if I were God, but if I were God, I might be reaching for my lightning bolt holster and saying, listen, pay attention, you people. But here's how God got their attention. He said, I hear your complaint, and I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. Does that remind anybody of a song? Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Think of any other bread-related metaphors in Scripture? How about give us this day our daily bread? How about I am the bread of life? So this is very significant, this manna thing. I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I will test them. So this is not only a provision, but with that provision, he's going to bring a lesson, not just about his grace and mercy, but about their trust and obedience. And here's how that happens. I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions on the 6th day when they prepared what they bring in. It will be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Do you think that the Hebrew people had any sense of obligation about a day of rest? No. In fact, we don't see the concept outside of God resting in Genesis. We don't see the concept of the Sabbath as a law to the people until actually this very chapter. First time you see it. And again, one of the rules about biblical interpretation is called first appearance. The first time you see something and you think, oh, well, that's a theme that we see in the Bible. That's a word that we see in the Bible. So that first appearance may be significant in setting the foundation for that concept, and I believe it is here. So this was the institution of the Sabbath. That didn't happen with the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments just restated this law that God was establishing. And we see what's the purpose for that law. Yes, it's nice for us to have rest on the Sabbath, but it also requires faith for a dependent and also in an agricultural community where, can I let my farm go for a day? Can I trust God to just let things go for one day out of the week, and later 1 year out of a period of time, and later give away all my obligations in 50 years? Yes, because, and to loan, it was against the law. Later we'll see it was against Jewish law to charge interest for a loan within the Jewish people. Now you could charge interest to somebody else. So what benefit do you get out of loaning somebody money if you don't have any profit from that, because it's a test of your faith that God will take care of you? Can I release my slaves every 7 years? How's that going to help me? It's a test of faith in God's provision. So this is where it was instituted. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, this evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So this is another confirmation of the big miracle. And in the morning you will see the Lord's glory, because he has heard your complaints about him. For who are we that you complain about us? Now Moses is having a little lecture about pastoral authority here. You're not complaining against me. You're complaining against God. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm not setting myself up as a priest or Moses. Moses continued, the Lord will give you meat to eat this evening, and all the bread you want in the morning, for he has heard the complaints that you are raising against him. Who are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. Let me talk about the new Pope for a little bit. And I'm happy for our Catholic friends. It's kind of interesting that we have an American Pope. I think that's really interesting. But we understand in Catholicism that the Pope really is in charge of God's church. That's their theology. And the reason that the Pope can be in charge is because Peter was in charge, because Jesus gave him the keys to the kingdom. which most of us interpret as when Peter declared that Jesus was Lord, it was on that truth that the church was established, not on Peter's merit that Jesus literally gave him the keys to the kingdom. But the image of Peter in Catholicism is that Peter was the first pope, and he had the authority over the other apostles. And so that authority was passed from pope to pope to pope to pope, and now here we are, how many ever deep we are into it. And the other apostles were considered bishops then under the authority of Peter, and that apostolic tradition was passed on as well. And so they have the apostolic succession of a bishop type title, and so the head guy appoints the other people as bishops. And so the Pope has, theologically in the Catholic understanding, as I understand it, the Pope has the same authority as Peter, which means that he can produce sacred writings that have the same apostolic authority as the authors of the New Testament, a position with which we in Protestantism disagree. There are other denominations who are more high church, and they also have a priesthood and a hierarchy. And here in our world, in Protestantism and in evangelicalism, we don't have priests. In that, you have to go through a priest to get to God. And that priests have the authority to forgive you, and so you must confess to the priest. My understanding from very clear New Testament teaching, so if you're relying on other teaching out of the New Testament, then you might have some proof texts outside of the 29 books that we rely on as gospel. But the books that we rely on as gospel says that there's one mediator between God and man, and that's Jesus himself. So you do not need me as a priest. You don't need me as a priest. Now, it's also clear in Scripture that there are people who are given different gifts and different positions within the church, but it's not a hierarchical position. It's a giftedness functional position. So, am I head of this church? I am not. All right? My job is to teach. Now, there are a lot of other things that a lot of other people think that perhaps I or someone in my position ought to be doing, and I'm sorry if that's disappointing, but my calling is to teach. And I also counsel, and I also comfort and those kinds of things. Certainly happy to do that and glad to do that. But we have an accountability. You don't have an accountability to me, except unless I need to point you out, like any other believer has the right to do, that says there's something that's offensive to the church in what you're doing and how you're behaving and how you're representing the church to the community. What we see is not the necessity of a human intercessor in Scripture. What we see is the necessity of fellowship of other Christians in Scripture. If you look to your left and your right, that person is far more important in the unity of the church and the building up of the church and the edification of the church and the perpetuation of the church than anybody that's standing up here. Is that new to you, or do you believe it?
Yeah.
So, and that's not to denigrate the position of pastor, overseer, or teacher, because those are clearly in Scripture. But let me tell you, the guy that's dropping fries at Carl's Jr. today has every bit as much scriptural authority to be a Christ follower and representative of Christ as this person right here. So important to do that. I've got a pretty decent resume. So did Paul the Apostle. And so my resume is as meaningful as Paul's was. And what did he compare his to? Dung.
That's it.
It's all about the Lord. Now, is there pastoral authority? I think there's evidence for the need for any overseer. We have gone in many Baptist churches to an elder system where you have the teaching elder, and then you have other elders, and they also have supervisory authority or at least shepherding authority, and a lot of different models. And as a shepherd, I do try to protect the flock. I have disinvited a number of people who were either wolves or wolves in sheep's clothing. I told you one of my favorite instances. I was outside one Sunday morning, and somebody drove up from another belief system and said, do you preach the rapture? And I said, well, I preach out of the book of Revelation. And she said, well, look at the Bible. The word rapture is never in there. And before I could say anything else, she threw a pamphlet at me about end times. So you can guess what group that was from. And so that was my first experience with a drive-by pamphleting. She later came back and apologized because, bless her heart. We don't have a religion like some that you see and you've encountered where you have to do some work in order to get your place in the kingdom. That's not us. That's not us. Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your complaints. As Aaron was speaking to the entire Israelite community, they turned toward the wilderness, and there, in a cloud, God's glory appeared. The Lord spoke to Moses, I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will eat bread until you are full. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. And we know that the quail came, and there's some stories about quail and how they often migrated based on the wind, and they would get tired, and sometimes, in the ancient days, they'd be so tired and flying so low that you could just grab them out of the sky. And so, I don't know, that's interesting, but it doesn't impact how miraculous it was in the context. And then in the morning, we don't even know what manna stands for, but one probable definition and root word is, what is it? Because it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. And we don't even know what it was. It talks about the color and consistency a little bit and the taste a little bit, but we don't know really what manna is. And so one of the blessings that God provided for the Hebrew people to sustain them was completely unknown to them. Again, make your own sermon. I will live in the mystery of God and give thanks for the what is this? Because that was one of the lessons that was given in the story of provision of manna. Well, my time is gone, and we have many, many grumblings and complaints yet to look at. But the faith aspect of this, the testing aspect of this, as you recall, is you eat everything. You don't store any of that manna or any of that quail, because I'll give you new in the morning. And you can collect double on Saturday or whatever the day before Sabbath is. We don't know what the Sabbath was. The calendar has changed so much. The Sabbath, people make a big deal out of that. the New Testament is you see them meeting and greeting, and they're doing all of their stuff on the first day of the week because it reflects the resurrection of Christ and a departure from the law. And again, the calendars, we don't know. That we think of, well, the Sabbath was probably Saturday in the Old Testament. It might have been Tuesday. It was a whole different calendar. So we don't need to get legalistic about that. But gather twice as much, and then the next day you'll rest, and there will be enough. And also, for those who aren't able to gather as much as others, no matter whether you gather more than you think you need or less than you think you need, everybody will have just the right amount. That was one of the miraculous aspects of the provision. But guess what happened? Some of the people said, well, I'm going to put a little bit aside. I'm going to go out early on the Sabbath morning before anybody else is up, and I'm going to get me some, what is it? Now, is that bad in and of itself? Yes, because it was a direct contradiction to God, because they were motivated not by trust, but by fear. Some of us may have possibly been in a position in life where we didn't know where the next meal was coming from, or how we were going to pay a bill, or how we were going to get from point A to point B. We don't live in a destitute poverty culture like many third world countries. And so it's hard for us, I talk about growing up poor, but I never missed a meal. And I knew how to get a meal if we didn't have anything in the fridge. And, my big hunger story is when we were living in a little town. It's a whole sad story, but one sad aspect of that is we didn't have anything to eat. And so I foraged around out in the garage and found a couple of MREs from my National Guard days, and we had supper. Most of us haven't really had to experience truly having to trust God for daily provision, but we need to be ready and able to trust God for daily provision.